December was merciless. Frosty winds drove clouds across the night sky, and rare lanterns cast a dim light on the snow-covered streets. People hurried home, hiding their faces in scarves. But behind the cold facade of a calm city, there was a story that would make your heart freeze. Sarah was sitting in the dim living room. The garlands on the Christmas tree flickered softly, and the silence of the house seemed almost oppressive. It was quiet outside the window, as if the whole world was waiting. She tried not to think about the fact that her husband James should have returned from work 2 hours ago. His phone wasn't answering, but Sarah reassured herself that it was probably just a dead battery. Frantically holding a mug of cooling cocoa in her hands, she was distracted by old photographs. In their house, cozy family photos decorated every room. One of them showed James with a wide, sincere laugh. On the other is their little son, smiling, with a bloody cheek from a bicycle fall. Their family had always been strong, but after the recent move, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. The neighbors they met a couple of weeks ago seemed a little strange, especially the old man from the house opposite, who often stood at the window and watched their house. Sarah tried to ignore his glances, but sometimes she found herself thinking that it was better to keep the curtains closed. The night was approaching its peak. Sarah was about to call the police when she suddenly heard a thud. The sound came from the kitchen. She turned her head sharply. My heart started beating faster. Maybe it's James. But instead of joy, an inexplicable horror seized her. She didn't remember him leaving the keys at home. Cautiously approaching the kitchen door, Sarah smelled a faint smell of burnt metal. The lock on the door hung askew, as if someone had tried to open it by brute force. Only the lights of the garlands were reflected in the kitchen window. No movement. But her anxiety began to grow. She grabbed the phone and quickly dialed her husband's number. The beeps were ringing, but no one answered. At that moment, Sarah noticed that the basement door was ajar, although she was sure she had closed it before going to bed. "Damn it, James, where are you?" she muttered, lowering the phone. Turning on the flashlight on her phone, she cautiously approached the basement stairs. The creaking of the old wooden steps was especially loud in the silence of the night. Sarah couldn't remember the last time they had used this room. The basement was filled with boxes of things left over from previous tenants. Sarah jokingly called it the cemetery of old junk, but now this place seemed ominous to her. She froze on the bottom step, holding the phone in front of her. The light of the lantern picked out the scattered boxes. It seemed like someone had already been here before her. Suddenly, a grinding noise was heard in the depths of the basement. Sarah froze, listening. She could have sworn she could hear breathing. "Who's here?" she shouted, but her voice sounded much weaker than she wanted it to. There was no answer. Sarah wanted to turn around and go back upstairs, but something made her stay. Perhaps it was just curiosity or fear that her husband might be in trouble. She took a step forward. The screeching became louder, almost deafening. Her breathing faltered as the light of the lantern fell on something that shouldn't have been there. There was a box in the far corner of the basement that Sarah had never seen before. It was wrapped with duct tape, and the inscription was scrawled on the lid, "Don't open it." Her hands were shaking as she slowly walked over to the box. The thought flashed through my head that it was better to leave it for later, but curiosity overcame me. She slowly tore off the tape, expecting to see old clothes or books. But there was a video camera inside. Sarah frowned as she pulled it out. The camera looked old and covered in dust, but when she pressed the power button, the screen lit up. There was only one video on it. She pressed play. An empty basement appeared on the screen. This basement. The camera was in the same corner where Sarah had found it. The video continued, and soon James appeared in the frame. His face was exhausted, and there were traces of blood on his hands. He was trying to say something, but the sound was muffled. Suddenly, other people appeared in the frame. They were dressed in dark clothes and, apparently, carried James to the depths of the basement. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a scream. Her legs weakened and she fell to her knees. She rewound the video further, but it stopped at the moment when one of the figures noticed the camera and began to move towards her. Suddenly, a light came on in the basement. Sarah looked up sharply and saw a man standing in the doorway. It was the old man from the house across the street. His face was expressionless. There were several other people standing behind him, but their faces were hidden by masks. "You shouldn't have seen this," he whispered. Sarah, speechless from shock, jerked back sharply, but her back hit the wall. My head was in chaos. How did they get in? Why this particular old man? And most importantly, where is James? Her breathing became rapid and ragged when she saw one of the masked men start down the stairs. Slowly, methodically, as if knowing she wasn't going anywhere. Sarah grabbed the camera convulsively, as if it could protect her. "Where is my husband?" she shouted, trying to make her voice sound firmer. But inside, everything was shaking with horror. The old man did not answer. Instead, he turned to his accomplices. "Finish it. Quickly," he said coldly. At that moment, Sarah realized that she had only one chance left. Her gaze fell on a small metal rod lying next to the box. She grabbed him and, not thinking what might happen, swung when the first of the strangers came too close. The blow was unexpected for the man, and he fell clutching his head. This gave Sarah a few seconds. She rushed to the stairs, but her foot caught on the edge of one of the boxes, and she fell, hitting her shoulder painfully. The phone flew out of my hand. The light went out. The world was plunged into almost complete darkness, broken only by the dim light of the lamp on the upper landing. Hurried footsteps sounded behind him. Sarah found her phone by touch and turned on the flashlight again. There were people down in the basement, and their breathing and muffled conversations echoed in her ears. They were getting closer. She got up and ran upstairs without looking back. The creaking of the stairs underfoot was deafening, but there was only one thought in my head: to get out of the house at any cost. When she reached the kitchen, she thought for a moment that she was saved. But then the door to the living room slammed shut with a thud. She saw her reflection in the mirror of the locker, another man in a mask. Her heart was pounding like crazy. Trying not to make any sudden movements, Sarah slowly bent down to pick up a knife from the kitchen table. "You weren't supposed to know. We didn't want this," came a voice, slightly muffled by the mask. "But you made your choice." Sarah turned abruptly and, without waiting for him to finish his sentence, stabbed him. The man staggered back, and the knife slipped out of her hand. Taking advantage of the confusion, Sarah ran out of the kitchen into the living room, and from there to the front door. But when she grabbed the handle, her heart collapsed. The door was locked from the outside. She heard a noise behind her. Looking back, she saw two more coming down the stairs. Now all the exits were blocked. In desperation, Sarah rushed to the window, broke the glass, and, despite the cuts, got out. Her legs carried her on their own. The cold snow burned her bare feet, but she ran without turning around. She knew she was being chased. The old man's house was nearby, but instead of running to the neighbors, Sarah headed into the woods, hoping to get lost in the trees. Her breath puffed out in clouds of steam, and branches whipped at her face. The noise behind him was getting louder. They didn't give up. At some point, Sarah tripped over a tree root and fell into the snow. Her hands found something hard, metallic. It was a hunting trap. Sarah froze, trying to figure out where she was. Through the silence of the forest, she could hear their voices. She went there. Find her before she reaches the road. Sarah remembered an old hunting trail that she had seen on maps before moving. If she could get to her, she would have a chance. She carefully skirted the trap and ran again, keeping her hand on the rib, where she felt a dull pain from the blow. The noise behind them suddenly stopped. It was even scarier than their approach. Sarah stopped, trying to catch the sounds. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. It was an old man. He was standing just a few meters away from her, holding a gun in his hands. "You were stubborn. I respect that. But you could have just stayed in the basement," he said, not taking his cold gaze off her. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah screamed, stepping back. "Some things are better not to know," he replied. At that moment, there was a loud sound of sirens. Headlights cut through the trees. The old man turned around, and Sarah took advantage of the moment. She ran towards the road, where, to her horror, she saw James's car overturned. Shots rang out behind her, but she didn't stop. She ran to the car, looked inside and saw that it was empty. Blood covered the driver's seat, but James was nowhere to be found. When the police found her, Sarah couldn't speak anymore. She was sitting on the ground, clutching the camera in her hands. But when the officers looked at the recording, it turned out to be empty. The police stood around the car, trying not to look at Sarah, who was still shaking from shock. Her hands were covered with dried blood, and her gaze was fixed somewhere in the distance. The officers were silent, only exchanging brief glances. No one knew where to start. One of them, the younger one, leaned over to Sarah. "Miss, can you explain what happened? Where is your husband?" Sarah didn't even seem to hear him. Her gaze wandered through the forest, as if she was looking for someone among the trees. At that moment, one of the policemen shouted, "There's something here. I found something. Oh my God, it's..." They rushed to the place where the scream came from. To the side, among the bushes, the policeman found blood-stained clothes, torn to pieces. The items belonged to James. "We have to comb the forest," the senior officer said, trying to remain calm. But while they were organizing the raid, a rumble came from behind the trees. A police car parked on the road suddenly caught fire. It broke out so quickly that no one had time to even get closer. "Someone burned it," one of the officers shouted. "Damn it, they're still here." Sarah got to her feet. For the first time, there was a twinkle of awareness in her eyes. "They're playing with you. They want you to come out of the woods." The officers did not listen to her. They hurriedly called for reinforcements and tried to put out the fire. Sarah stood aside, realizing that the police did not realize what they were dealing with. She knew one thing: those people wouldn't stop. When the search began, Sarah stayed with a young officer who was not involved in the forest. He was trying to calm her down. "It's going to be all right. We will find your husband and these people." Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand. They..." Her words were cut short when she heard the distant sound of a gunshot. The officer grabbed the radio. "Squad, respond." Who fired the shot? There was no response. The forest, which had just been filled with the noise of the police, fell into an ominous silence. "We're leaving," Sarah said firmly. "No, we can't. Reinforcements will be here in 15 minutes. The officer looked confused. "Those 15 minutes could cost you your life. You don't know them." And then a man came out of the forest. It was one of the policemen. His face was covered in blood. He was holding his side. They know where you are," he croaked, falling to his knees. Before anyone could react, another person appeared behind him. A black mask. An axe is in his hands. The blow was fast and accurate. The policeman fell face down. "Run!" Sarah screamed at the officer, but he froze, unable to move. The mask turned to them. The man stepped forward, slowly, as if enjoying the situation. Sarah grabbed the officer by the arm and pulled him towards the forest. They were running. Sarah no longer felt pain in her legs. Branches scratched his face, and his clothes were torn. Heavy footsteps could be heard behind him. It was like hunting, and they knew that their pursuers were in no hurry. They finally reached the old hunting lodge that Sarah had noticed earlier. The door was dilapidated. The windows were boarded up. But there was no choice. They ran inside and closed the door. "Do you have a weapon?" Sarah asked, catching her breath. The officer shook his head. "The radio is broken." At that moment, something hit the door. Sarah grabbed a board lying on the floor and pressed it against the door. "We can't stay here," the officer whispered. "We have nowhere to go." The door burst open. Two masked men burst into the house. Sarah and the officer ran in different directions. One of the attackers rushed after the officer. The other went to Sarah. She grabbed something heavy, an old lantern, and hit it. The mask cracked. The man fell. But the second one was already there. Sarah screamed as his hand grabbed her hair. The officer, meanwhile, grabbed a knife from the kitchen. He rushed at the attacker who was holding Sarah. The blade went deep. The masked man let go of Sarah and collapsed. But the joy was short-lived. They heard more footsteps outside the door. "They'll never stop," Sarah whispered. She looked at the officer who was injured and realized that their chances of survival were fading. Sarah realized that there was nothing more to hope for. They had no chance of survival, no time to change anything. Desperation mixed with determination flashed in her eyes. She looked at the officer, breathing heavily. "We can't just wait," she said in a whisper. "They're playing with us while we're helpless." The officer, leaning against the wall, nodded, barely holding the knife. But his face changed when he noticed that Sarah was looking at the front door with a strange expression. She looked up at the ceiling, as if listening to something. "Do you hear that?" "What is it?" she asked. The officer shook his head. Sarah went to the table, took an old hunting lamp and lit it. The light of a weak flame illuminated the house. She silently began to inspect the walls. "What are you doing?" the officer asked, coughing. "They've been here a long time," Sarah whispered. "This is not their first hunt." In the corner of the room, she noticed something strange, uneven lines on the wooden panel, as if someone had carved something with a knife. As she got closer, she saw the scratched-out inscriptions. "Don't leave them alive. Never go out first. They are always there." Sarah backed away, pressing herself against the wall. The lines seemed fresh. "Who did this?" she whispered. The answer came suddenly when the door flew off its hinges with a bang. New figures burst into the house. They were bigger, more powerful than the ones that attacked earlier. But now there was no slowness or desire to play with their victims in their movements. They acted quickly and accurately, like professionals. The officer managed to move forward, trying to protect Sarah. His knife cut into the neck of one of the attackers, but immediately another grabbed his arm and threw him across the house. The officer hit the wall and didn't move anymore. Sarah was left alone. She was dragged outside, somewhere in the woods. But she knew that this was the end. Roughly tied up, with a bag over her head, she could smell gasoline. They were talking to each other, but the words were drowned out by the panic pounding in her temples. When the bag was torn off, Sarah saw a scene that finally killed her hope. A huge bonfire was burning in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. There were dozens of people standing around him. Men, women, even children. They were all wearing masks. There was a table in front of the fire, on which lay tools, knives, hammers, chains. Sarah noticed fresh blood on some of them. 3 masked men lifted her up, putting her on her knees in front of the crowd. One of them took off his mask. It was the same man who had first attacked them in the cabin. His face was frighteningly calm. "Do you think it's an accident that you're here?" he said. His voice was smooth, like a teacher explaining a task. Sarah didn't say anything. "Every year we look for people like you. We show them what it means to be prey. We show what it means to live in fear." He raised his hand, and the crowd responded with muffled approval. "But you lasted longer. We even started to respect your stubbornness." The man leaned closer, his breath smelling of tobacco. "You deserve a chance." He stepped back, giving a sign. The crowd parted, revealing a small path into the forest. "Run away." Sarah froze. Her heart was pounding. It was a trap, and she knew it. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can do whatever you want with me. Just let the others go." The man chuckled. "The others?" He stepped aside, and Sarah saw 3 people pulling out the bodies. Her husband, the policeman, even that woman from home. They were all dead. Sarah looked at the bodies, realizing that everything was in vain. None of them were alive. "No," she whispered. The man took a knife from the table. "You have a choice. You can stay here with them, or you can run." She knew that no matter which path she chose, it would end the same way. She was already dead. Her body just hadn't figured it out yet.